In 1929, a man named Jesse Livermore made more money in a single month than most people earn in 10 lifetimes. He read the market like other people read a room. And yet, 4 separate times in his life, he lost every cent of it.
40 years later, a pitcher named Steve Blass held a World Series ring in his hand. And then, with no injury, no warning, he couldn't throw a ball 60 feet anymore. 2 men, 2 centuries, the same invisible force. If you've ever felt life turning against you, it wasn't luck.
This isn't a video about superstition or the universe testing you. It's about a real psychological law. One of the most misquoted men in modern psychology actually wrote almost a century ago. By the end, you'll understand why some people walk through minefields untouched and others detonate the same mine twice. In 1958, neurologist Klaus Conrad named something your brain does constantly: aporia, seeing meaningful patterns in pure randomness. Statisticians call it a type 1 error, seeing a signal in the noise. And here's the unsettling part. It isn't a flaw. It's a survival feature you never asked for.
Imagine standing in tall grass 60,000 years ago.
The grass moves, probably wind. But if you're wrong, you're dead. Error management theory shows the math is brutal. Assuming danger costs a moment of fear. Assuming safety when there's real danger costs your life. So your brain learned to always assume the worst. That ancient wiring is still active inside you right now. It's why a string of bad days stops feeling random and starts feeling like a curse. Your nervous system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what kept your ancestors alive. It just wasn't built for a world this complicated. Here's a test. Put 23 random strangers in a room. What are the odds that 2 of them share a birthday? Most people guess somewhere around 5 or 10%. 365 days, only 23 people. It feels impossible. But human intuition is catastrophically bad at estimating coincidence. The real answer isn't 5%. It's over 50. This is the birthday problem, and it's one of the most famous demonstrations in probability theory. Because we don't think in combinations, we think in single comparisons. With 23 people, you're not making one comparison, you're making 253 all at once. Now, stretch that same math across an entire human life. Not 23 people, millions of moments, thousands of decisions, encounters and near misses layered on top of each other for decades. At that scale, the numbers stop being surprising. They start being unavoidable. Statisticians Percy Diaconis and Frederick Mostella gave this a name that sounds almost like a joke: the law of truly large numbers. The principle: with a large enough sample size, wildly improbable events aren't just possible, they're inevitable. Across one lifetime, a handful of impossible coincidences are actually guaranteed. So why does it still feel like fate? Because of what your memory quietly discards. You don't remember the 10,000 ordinary Tuesdays. You remember the one where everything collapsed. And your mind, desperate for a story, links it backward to every other bad day you've ever had. That's not destiny. That's selective memory wearing destiny's coat. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. Because the man who would eventually explain why certain patterns really do seem to follow specific people wasn't a statistician at all. He was a psychiatrist, and his obsession began with a solid oak table that split cleanly in half for no reason at all. That young man was Carl Jung. Not long after the table split, a steel knife sitting untouched in a drawer shattered into pieces. His mother, deeply superstitious, saw both events as unmistakable signs from beyond. Jung didn't dismiss it, but he didn't fully believe it either. Jung did something rarer than belief or disbelief. He got curious enough to spend the rest of his career investigating it scientifically. That curiosity would eventually pull him into intense, apocalyptic visions of European catastrophe, visions he privately recorded in a leather-bound journal that would later become known as the Red Book. In 1928, something arrived that redirected his entire life's work. A Chinese alchemical text called The Secret of the Golden Flower, translated by sinologist Richard Wilhelm. Where Western science obsessed over cause and effect, this Eastern tradition prioritized something else entirely: the meaningful coincidence of events. Jung set aside his private visions and returned to clinical work, carrying a new question with him. What if mind and matter weren't separate systems at all, but two expressions of something deeper, older, and far stranger than either psychology or physics had dared to suggest?
He spent the next 20 years exploring that question with an unlikely partner, Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel Prize-winning quantum physicist. Together they proposed something they called the Psychoid archetype, a layer of reality so fundamental that matter and psyche become almost indistinguishable inside it. In 1952, they published their findings jointly. Jung called his half of the theory synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle where events are linked not by cause and effect, but by meaning. This is the exact concept that got turned into a bumper sticker quote and spread across the internet a billion times. You've probably seen this sentence somewhere: a screenshot, a meditation app, maybe even a tattoo. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. It's everywhere. According to every serious review of Jung's actual writing, it's also a sentence he never wrote. Here's the real line documented in Aion, Volume 9 of his collected works. When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Notice the difference. The popular version is passive, mysterious. The real version is mechanical, describing a process with moving parts. That's not mysticism. That's a psychological engine with moving parts. When a person stays divided against themselves, carrying an unexamined fear, an unresolved shadow, a conflict they refuse to face, the world doesn't wait patiently. It acts the conflict out for them, in full view, whether they consented to it or not. In real life, this looks like someone who keeps attracting the same emotionally unavailable partner and calls it coincidence. Someone whose ventures collapse at the same stage every time and calls it bad timing. Someone who provokes the same conflict with every boss they've ever had and calls it bad luck with management. In every one of these cases, Jung's framework points somewhere uncomfortable. Not outward, at fate, but inward, at the part of the self that was never resolved. The world isn't cursing you. It's staging something you haven't finished processing, using the only material available: your actual life. To understand why some people keep walking back into the same fire, we need to leave Jung's office for a moment and step into a quiet coffee shop in Hertfordshire, England, where a psychologist secretly dropped a £5 note on the pavement just to see who would notice it. For 10 years, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, psychologist Dr. Richard Wiseman ran one of the strangest and most rigorous studies in the history of luck research. He recruited over 400 volunteers who called themselves consistently lucky or consistently unlucky, and put their entire lives under a microscope. One experiment was almost cruelly simple. Wiseman asked participants to count the photographs in a newspaper. On page 2, in massive bold type covering half the page, he'd printed a message: "Stop counting. There are 43 photographs in this newspaper." The self-described lucky participants noticed it in seconds and finished instantly. The unlucky participants scanned right past it, sometimes for minutes,
locked so tightly onto their task that an enormous, unmissable message became completely invisible to them. Wiseman's data pointed to a single underlying trait: neuroticism. Chronic anxiety and tension physically narrows a person's visual field. Not metaphorically, literally. Anxious brains develop tunnel vision, filtering out anything that isn't directly tied to their immediate worry. Then came the coffee shop test. Wiseman staged a small cafe with only 4 tables, one occupied by a successful businessman, the rest filled with actors. Outside, on the pavement, he placed a £5 note in plain view and simply watched who would see it. The lucky participants spotted the money instantly, pocketed it, walked in, ordered a coffee, and sat beside the businessman. In several real cases, sparking a conversation that led to genuine opportunities. Same street, same shop. Completely different outcome. The unlucky participant stepped directly over the money without seeing it, ordered their coffee in visible tension, and sat alone, oblivious to both the windfall on the ground and the connection sitting 3 feet away from them. This was never really about chance. It was about what a stressed mind is capable of seeing. This is the mechanism hiding behind nearly every story of good or bad luck you've ever heard. But attention alone doesn't explain the deepest, most painful pattern of all. The one where someone doesn't just miss opportunities, but walks straight toward disaster. In 1914, Sigmund Freud described a pattern in his patients that still holds up under modern clinical scrutiny. He called it repetition compulsion. People who experienced early relational wounds don't usually remember those wounds as memories. They reenact them, live in their adult relationships, without ever realizing they're repeating anything at all. The theory behind it is almost tragic in its logic. The psyche isn't trying to suffer for no reason. It's trying to achieve mastery, to return to the scene of the original wound, and this time, finally get it right. So it seeks out familiar dynamics, even painful ones, because familiar feels safer than unknown. When that pattern collapses again, the person rarely sees their own unconscious hand in choosing it. They see only the outcome, and they call it bad luck. A related but distinct trap goes even further, one where the mind stops trying to change anything at all. Psychologist Martin Seligman called it learned helplessness. After enough exposure to uncontrollable hardship, the mind stops trying to change its circumstances, even when a real opportunity to escape finally appears. It isn't laziness, it's a nervous system that has been taught, again and again, that effort doesn't matter. So if unconscious patterns can manufacture bad luck, can the reverse be trained? One athlete's story says yes. In 1972, Steve Blass was an all-star, a World Series hero. A year later, with no injury and no explanation, he simply lost the ability to throw a baseball accurately. The condition became known as the Yips. A 2021 EEG study revealed what was actually happening. Under pressure, these athletes' brains showed a spike in alpha band activity, a signature of the conscious mind reaching in and grabbing the controls of a skill that was supposed to run automatically. Sports psychologist Gabriella Wolf calls this a shift from external focus, trusting the target, to internal focus, micromanaging your own wrist, grip, and arm angle. The moment that switch flips, fluid motor skill becomes jerky, conscious, and broken. A player we'll call Brian developed the same yips and did exactly what conventional advice recommends: positive self-talk, daily journaling, conscious mental rehearsal. Weeks later, nothing had changed. If anything, his frustration deepened, and he began to believe some part of him was resisting his own recovery. Then he tried something different. Brainspotting, a technique using a fixed point in the visual field to locate and process tension held far below conscious thought, deep in the brain's subcortical structures, the exact layer that willpower and self-talk can never quite reach. Over 6 sessions, without ever telling himself to think positive, Brian's clinician helped him track the physical sensation of the yips to its source and process it directly. The tension released. His automatic throwing motion returned, smooth and unforced, exactly as it had been before. The lesson isn't really about baseball. It's this. Some patterns don't respond to being thought your way out of. They respond to being felt through, at a level underneath language entirely. The same level where Jung's undivided opposite has been quietly running the show all along. Wiseman didn't stop at describing lucky and unlucky people. He tested whether luck could be taught. He built what he called the Luck School, a program training unlucky volunteers in specific, learnable habits of attention, expectation, and response. Stay relaxed enough to actually see opportunity. Trust intuitive hunches as real data. Genuinely expect good outcomes, because expectation fuels persistence after setbacks. And when misfortune does happen, refuse to dwell. Take one concrete step to prevent it from happening again. The results weren't vague or anecdotal. Participants reported measurable, lasting increases in perceived luck, confidence, and even physical well-being. None of it required changing the universe. It required changing where attention was allowed to go. The same mechanism from the newspaper experiment, now used on purpose. Imagine walking down that same street again, the one with the £5 note and the coffee shop. Only this time, your eyes are open. This time, you see the note. This time, you sit beside the stranger. Nothing about the world changed. Only your attention did. So, was it ever really luck? Not in the way you were taught. Not a curse, not a blessing handed down from somewhere outside you. What looks like fate is usually a mind finding patterns in noise, a nervous system too anxious to see what's right in front of it, or an old, unfinished conflict finally stepping outside to finish itself. Jung's real words, not the ones the internet gave him, describe something almost mechanical. What stays unconscious doesn't disappear. It gets lived out instead of understood, which means the opposite is also true. The moment you look directly at what you've been avoiding, the outside world loses its only job. It stops having to act it out for you. And that was never luck. That was always you.